I am reading this morning from Genesis 12, 1 to 9. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions that they had accumulated, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he went toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev.
Thank you, Julie, for bringing us that reading this morning. For years, I have dabbled on and off in family history, my family history. I've traced some of my family back 8 generations to ancestors born in the early 1700s in England and the Shetland Islands. This is a picture of my great-great-great-great-grandparents on my mother's side, Thomas and Anne Goodman. My mother was a Goodman. Thomas was a baker, and he married Anne when they were both about 21 in Nottingham, England. And 5 months after their marriage, they boarded a ship with Anne's parents and most of her family and sailed to New Zealand, where they arrived in 1843 in a town called Nelson, just down the road from the town that Glenda and I were born and grew up in. Thomas started a bakery in our hometown, and through his subsequent descendants, that bakery business became one of New Zealand's largest food companies internationally around the world. Our side of the family missed out on that wealth. In researching my family history, I've discovered that Glenda and I are related. And you thought Tasmania had all the problems. Glenda is a descendant of Anne's parents. And so we discovered that as we were looking at our family tree. There has been a rising popularity in family history right around the world. I think attributed probably to the rise of the internet. When I started doing this, there was no internet. You'd have to go to a family history place and look at physical bits of paper. And also the accessibility of DNA research, where you can now give DNA testing kits to your family as presents, as Christmas presents. Maybe you've delved into your family history at some level. Why do we do it? What is the attraction to looking back hundreds and hundreds of years to see where you came from? Is it to find out who we are? Is it to find out our identity? Maybe the hope that we will unearth some connection to royalty or some important figure down through history. Well, in this series, we are going to look back at the beginning of our family history as Christians, where we discover kind of a scandal in this family. Right near the beginning, we find someone who was probably a moon worshipper, who passed his wife off as his sister to save his own skin, and did it not once but twice. And this person is Abraham. Now maybe you're thinking, oh, Abraham is way too far. I'm talking 8 generations, looking where I've gone. This is way, way, way back for that to be of any significance to us today in 2026. We can accept that Moses is important to the Jewish people. Maybe we would accept he's important to Muslims. But for Christians, we see ourselves as Jesus' people, not Abraham's people. Well, here in Genesis chapter 12 that Julie has read to us this morning, we're almost as far back before Jesus as we are to Jesus. If you look at it on a timeline, Jesus is somewhere in the middle of this timeline. And we've jumped in Scripture today 2,000 years before. Oh, that doesn't come up very good, does it? Sorry. That's 2000 BC under Abraham. We've jumped 2,000 years before Jesus, and we are 2,000 years after Jesus. So here in the beginning of Genesis 12, nearly 4,000 years ago, we see reference to Jesus. The good news of Jesus as it was shaped in the promises given to Abraham. So Abraham provides some very an essential starting point for every Christian's family tree. The essential foundation for every Christian's storyline. Abraham matters to us and our faith. But before Abraham became this amazing man of faith that we admire, he was simply a man whom God called. And that's where the story begins here in the beginning of chapter 12. Abraham's story begins in the ancient Mesopotamian city of Ur. And Ur is down here in what today is southern Iraq, is where Ur was located. A city built around a temple to the moon god Nana. And moon god worship dominated the whole of life in the city of Ur from birth to death. And it's in this dark place, a dark place of moon worshippers, that God speaks to Abraham, who at this time was called Abram, a descendant of Noah through Noah's son Shem, 10 generations between Shem and Abraham. We read of this surprising call of God to Abram in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." That's a pretty daunting call from God. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your household, your father's household, your nuclear family, and go. But even more daunting than this call that God gives to Abraham, God didn't tell Abraham where he was going. God just says, "Go to the land I will show you." Abram wasn't told that this land that God was sending him was Canaan until Abraham actually got there. And God said, "This is the place." This call to leave everything and follow God is very much like the call of the gospel. Jesus says, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." Notice as we're going through this story today that Abram isn't looking for God. He isn't on some spiritual quest to find God. God comes looking for Abram. The story begins not with human faithfulness on the part of Abraham, but with divine grace. Now, we don't know when God comes and talks and calls Abram. In verse 1, it just says, the Lord had said to Abram. Was it when he was in Ur, down in this part here? Or was it as they made their journey along the river to Haran? Was that where God called to Abram? We don't know. And Haran is up in present-day Turkey. We also don't know how long Abram stayed in Haran with his father. He could have left as soon as Terah had got to Haran and decided to put down roots there. Or maybe Abram stayed right till his father had died and then continued on this journey. We don't know. But the point is, he obeyed God's call. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Abram recognizes the voice of the one true God, the God Yahweh, whom he later refers in chapter 14 of Genesis as God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. A voice he acknowledges in all of the noise and the idolatrous clamor of his moon worshipping culture. Without any arguments, without any questions, he doesn't question God, he just obeys. And he goes. And he goes with a promise from God. Unbelievable promises. Look at verse 2, where these promises come from God. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse you. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This, on one hand, is a specific promise to one person, a promise to one individual that God has singled out from all the rest of the people of the world for dealings with him and his family. And it's also a global promise, a universal promise, a promise that even extends to the people, all the people on the earth, every tribe, every nation, every language on this planet. And it's a promise that will ultimately be fulfilled through Jesus. So let's pause for a moment and just consider a bit of the backstory to all that's going on here up to this point in the story. God has made this wonderful, wonderful, beautiful creation, this beautiful world, and yet humans have messed it up. Messed it up by turning their backs on the Creator God. A wonderful world, as we see in Genesis 1 and 2. A wonderful world devastated and spoiled and undone by sin. And because sin comes into this beautiful world through Adam and Eve, we read God saying in Genesis 3, "Cursed is the ground because of you." A curse on this creation that he has just made. God pronounces on the world a curse because of all the evil the humans had done in turning their backs on their Creator. And yet here in chapter 12, just a few chapters later, the God who had pronounced a curse is now promising a blessing. The curse was deserved. The blessing was not. And the blessing comes entirely from grace, the grace of God. And suddenly here in Genesis 12, God singles out Abram, one man, and says, "I will bless you." Not because of anything he's done. We know almost nothing about Abram, apart from who his father was, where he lived, who he married. That's all we know. So not because of anything he'd done, not because he was less sinful or less bad than anyone else around him. There's nothing in the story that would indicate that. But simply because it is in God's character. It's in the character of God to bless in an undeserved, gracious way. And not just to bless Abraham, but to bless the world. And we'll hear more about this as we go through this promise that would extend to every single person in the world through the good news of Jesus. So what are these promises? Andrew Sash describes these promises as amazing promises that are incredibly good and almost incredible. They're unbelievable. They're difficult to believe. God promises three things to Abram. First, that he will live in Canaan, the promised land. After Abram leaves his father in Haran and continues south with he and his wife Sarai, who will later be called Sarah, and his nephew Lot, they reach Canaan. And there in verse 7 we read, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So that's the first promise, the promise of land. A land that will be later called a land flowing with milk and honey. In the ancient Mediterranean world, milk and honey were associated with abundance and hospitality, celebration, nourishment, a beautiful land, a land with extraordinary provision. So the promise of a wonderful land. And second, the promise of people, of many, many descendants. Look at verse 2. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. In a couple of chapters, in chapter 15 ahead of us, God will say to Abram, you'll have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. And then God will reaffirm that promise again in Genesis 22, not just as many stars in the sky, but as many sands as there are on the seashore. Innumerable and uncountable number of descendants. I'll have more to say about those two promises in a moment. But the third promise that God makes to Abram is he won't just become a great nation, but he will become a great name. And there's incredible irony in this part of the promise. In the chapter before this, in chapter 11, we see the story of these proud rebels that make this tower in the city of Babel. A tower that they make in their own words to make a name for themselves. It must have been a remarkable structure, a remarkable piece of architecture. But you know that today we don't know a single name of anybody had anything to do with that tower. No name of who designed it, no name of anyone who worked on it. They are lost in history. But God says to Abram, I will make your name great. I will make your name great. And today, Abraham's name is known right around the world. So 3 blessings, 3 promises. A promise of a place to live, a promise of people to live in that place, and the promise of a great name. But right at the start of God giving these promises to Abram comes with them problems. With every promise comes a problem, like a roadblock. Problem 1, the land is occupied. Problem 2, Sarah is infertile. So the first problem, the land God is giving to Abram to live in is inhabited by the Canaanites. And we see that happening in verse 6. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh in Shechem. This is a tree where the Canaanites would worship their gods, watching the way the leaves rustled in the wind to determine what their God was saying to them. And we see here Moses then puts an altar at that place to his God. But at that time, verse 6 goes on, the Canaanites were in the land. If you know anything about the story of the Bible as it unfolds throughout the Old Testament, you know that this is the first sign of trouble. The Canaanites, the people who were residents in this land, will be a constant thorn in Abraham's side. They're people that need to be conquered because of their incredible evil in the sight of God. And they'll be the cause of war and trouble for Abraham and his descendants. So it's not like Abraham can waltz into this land that's God giving him and then grab his camp chair, set up and sit back and relax. Ahead for Abram is trouble. God's second promise to Abraham is that he will father a nation. But again, there's another problem. Back in the genealogy, at the end of chapter 11, we see a red flag. In verse 30, now Sarai was childless because she was unable or not able to conceive. Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children. Sarah is infertile. This is before the wonders of IVF. So for Abram and Sarah, this seems an impossibility. There's no way that they can have lots of descendants. So now we have a big question. A question of trust. Can we trust God to keep his promises? This will be a question that comes up again and again in this series. Can God be trusted? It's really two questions in one. First, is God faithful to the promises he makes? Does God keep his word when he makes a promise? And then second, will Abram trust him? Will Abram trust God? And we'll see those two questions coming out through the rest of the story. Does God keep his word? Will Abram trust him? Genesis is a book about God's promises. God makes promises to Abraham. We've seen this morning. He makes them 3 times. Here in chapter 12 and then in chapter 15, and we'll see in a couple of weeks. And then again in chapter 17. The same promise repeated 3 times. And later in Genesis, God repeats the promise to Abraham's son, Isaac. He hears it several times as God is working through Isaac's life. And then God repeats his promise again to Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Running through this whole book of Genesis, like the backbone of the book, are these promises from God. But the other thing that runs through this story is the question of whether Abraham will believe in these promises. Will Abraham believe what God has said? And the final verdict on Abraham, is a spoiler alert here, Abraham does. Abraham believes. And because Abraham trusted God, he's held up in the New Testament. He's called the man of faith in Genesis chapter 3. He's the man who's held up perhaps more than anyone else in the New Testament. A model of what it means to trust in God. He's there in Galatians. There's a whole chapter in the book of Romans, chapter 4 of Romans, as an example of his faith. And he gets the biggest chunk of Hebrews chapter 11, this great hall of fame where the writer shows the faith of all the people down through history in the Old Testament, those who trusted in God. And the biggest part of that chapter is given over to Abraham. So this story, indeed the whole book of Genesis, is about God's trustworthiness. The promises God makes and the need for us to trust in those promises, following Abraham as our model. So that's going to be the focus as we go through this series over the next 8 weeks. That's why I hope this is going to be a useful and practically helpful series as we struggle through life, knowing, do we trust God or do we not? Has God's promised these things, but can we trust him? Now, here in this story, we've got something to measure God's trustworthiness against. It's not that God can just do easy things and not hard things. These 2 things here are hard things, very hard things. The test is not, the test is God can and God will do these things. He says he'll do what he says. But for now, Abram's got to take all these promises on face value, just on trust. God has said it, so I've got to trust him. But the outlook for Abram in this whole story, this whole situation, it looking ahead, it looks impossible. How can God ever do this? The obstacles seem insurmountable. Can God be trusted? Is God faithful to what he says? We can test God's faithfulness against the story of Genesis. But because we live on this side of the story of Jesus, we know that those promises to Abram aren't just for Abraham and his family. They're promises for God to bless the whole world. And we know God does that through one of Abraham's descendants, Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of these promises. So we can ask the question, is God faithful? Is God faithful in the story of Genesis? Or we can ask the question in an even bigger time, and looking at the whole of the Bible, and say, yes, God has kept his promises, every one, again and again. God keeps his promises to Abraham. God keeps his promise by sending Jesus. God's done it. What God has said, God has done. God is faithful. Will we trust him today? We'll come back to trusting God later in the series, but we need to remember that we must trust God for what God has actually promised, and not on the promises that we attribute to him that God never promised. God never promised that our life would be easy. He never promised we wouldn't experience grief. He never promised that we'd always be healthy and prosperous. But he has promised never to leave us. He has promised to forgive us. He has promised eternal life in Jesus. Abraham trusted God's amazing promises for him and his family, but God's plan was never just about Abram. From the beginning, God had the nations in view. You see that in verse 3 again. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Abraham saw this first part of this blessing worked out in his own life. Melchizedek and Abimelech were blessed because they honored Abraham and honored God. But Hagar was cut off from Abram's family for despising Sarah. The Canaanites, who attacked and persecuted Israel, have now disappeared from history. But this story isn't just for Jewish people. Abram's call ends with the wonderful promise that all the peoples on earth will be blessed through him. God called Abraham to bless us. Jesus is right there in that initial promise to Abraham and in Abraham's family tree. He's one of Abraham's descendants. He's the one who makes these promises come true. And we find our place in the family tree and the remarkable storyline of the Bible because of Jesus. Paul tells us, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So if you're a Jesus man or a Jesus woman, these promises are for you. We find ourselves in Abraham's family tree, not by following father to son to grandson, but we see it through following the faith line. Abraham had faith in God's promises. He relied on them. He lived his life trusting these promises, as we'll see as we go through this series over the coming weeks. Those who have faith in Jesus, who rely on him, who live our lives trusting him, we find ourselves in Abraham's family tree. This family tree of blessing. We're included in the family. A verse we all know so well is, for God so loved the world. God so loved you and me that God called Abraham to bless us. His story is our story. His God is our God. God's promises to Abraham find their fulfillment in Jesus, and through Jesus, they become ours. This is the story that undoes the curse of Genesis 3. And as Christians, we are part of that story. As we research our family history, we discover surprising things about our ancestors, where they lived, what they did. They fill out our story. They show us who we are through history. They tell us where we've come from. Genesis tells us where we come from spiritually. We belong to a family that began when God's gracious call to a moon worshipper named Abram. And because God kept his promise to Abraham, we can trust him for every promise that he has made to us in Jesus. And that's why Abraham and Abraham's story matters to us. His story is our story. Let's pray.